At 6:20 in the morning on Tuesday, 14 October 1943, engines began turning across the concrete hard stands of RAF Thorpe Abbotts. Ground crew from the 100th Bombardment Group moved between aircraft with flashlights and clipboards. The sky above eastern England was still dark, but the sound of radial engines already rolled across the base. One of the bombers waiting on the perimeter track was a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress carrying the serial number 42-30792. Inside the aircraft, the 10-man crew prepared for a mission that planners believed would cripple a vital German industrial target. The pilot, Captain Robert Morgan, checked the instrument panel, while the co-pilot, Lieutenant James Taylor, completed the engine warm-up procedure for the 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Behind them, in the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Wilson inspected the Norden bomb site, carefully adjusting the stabilizer gyros. The target was the Kugel-Fischer ball bearing factories. Ball bearings were essential for German war production. They were used in tank transmissions, aircraft engines, truck axles, and artillery mechanisms. Without them, entire production lines could stall. United States strategic planners believed that destroying the factories in Schweinfurt could cripple German industry for months. However, the target was deep inside Germany. The round-trip distance from England was more than 1,400 miles. Escort fighters could not accompany the bombers the entire way. That fact alone shaped everything that would follow. At 6:45 in the morning, Captain Morgan pushed the 4 throttles forward. The B-17 rolled down the runway. Within seconds, the heavy bomber lifted into the cold October air, joining a growing formation climbing east over the North Sea. By 7:30 in the morning, more than 290 B-17 bombers from multiple groups had formed into combat boxes above England. The formation structure was deliberate. Each bomber carried 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns positioned in nose, dorsal, ventral ball turret, waist, and tail stations. Individually, a bomber was vulnerable. But in tight formation, overlapping gunfire created a defensive web. The theory was simple. German fighters would have to fly directly into a wall of heavy machine gun fire. But theory and reality rarely matched over Germany. At 9:10 in the morning, the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coastline. Inside the aircraft, the radio operator monitored the SCR-274N radio set, listening for formation commands. Temperature inside the bomber dropped below freezing. The aircraft had no insulation. Gunners wore electrically heated flight suits powered by cables running from the bomber electrical system. In the dorsal turret, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper rotated the twin 50 caliber M2 machine guns, scanning the sky above the formation. For the moment, the sky remained empty. That calm was temporary. German radar stations along the coast had already detected the incoming bomber stream. Within minutes, intercept orders were moving through the fighter command network of the Luftwaffe. Airfields across western Germany began launching interceptors. Among them were squadrons flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190. Both aircraft were equipped with 20mm MG-151 cannons, weapons capable of damaging a bomber with only a few hits. At 10:15 in the morning, the American formation approached the German border near Aachen. The escort fighters began turning back. Groups of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had protected the bombers across the North Sea, but the Thunderbolt did not yet have the fuel range to follow the formation all the way to Schweinfurt. Captain Morgan watched the escort fighters peel away in small groups. Within minutes, the bombers were alone. Inside the waist gun position, Sergeant Michael Torres adjusted the feed belt of his 50 caliber machine gun. The gun fired 700 rounds per minute, but ammunition inside the aircraft was limited. Each gunner carried roughly 400 rounds. If the fighters came in waves, that supply could disappear quickly. At 10:28 in the morning, the first radar reports reached German fighter controllers. American bombers were approaching central Germany. Interceptors were directed toward the formation from multiple airfields. Among the first units climbing toward the bombers was Jagerschwader 11. Their fighters were already accelerating toward the incoming bombers. Inside the American formation, the gunners still saw nothing. But the distance between the bomber stream and the first German fighters was shrinking rapidly. The crews had trained for this moment. They knew the standard German attack patterns: head-on passes, high-speed diving attacks, multiple waves designed to wear down defensive gunners. But what the crews did not know was how many waves were already forming ahead of them. And when the first fighters finally appeared, they would not arrive alone. They would arrive from 3 directions at once. The crew of Captain Morgan would soon face the first of 3 separate fighter attacks before reaching their target. And the first wave was already less than 10 minutes away. At 10:37 in the morning, the first warning came from the tailgun position. Staff Sergeant Leonard Davis leaned forward in the narrow tail compartment of the Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress and pressed his face closer to the armored glass. 2 dark shapes appeared low on the horizon behind the bomber formation. Within seconds, those shapes multiplied. Davis lifted the interphone microphone. "Fighters, 6 o'clock low." Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Morgan immediately tightened the formation spacing with the aircraft ahead. Tight formations were essential because the defensive power of the 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns depended on overlapping fire. At 10:38 in the morning, the first wave arrived. More than 20 interceptors from Jagdgeschwader 11 approached from below the bomber stream. The fighters were a mix of Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. German pilots had learned that the lower rear quarter of the bomber formation offered the best approach angle. From that position, they could climb through the formation at high speed while firing cannon shells into vulnerable fuselage sections. The first Bf-109 pulled upward toward the bomber line. Inside the waist gun position, Sergeant Michael Torres tracked the incoming fighter through the open window. Distance dropped quickly. 800 yards, 600, 400. Torres squeezed the trigger. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun began firing in short bursts. The heavy weapon produced a sharp recoil as brass cartridges spilled across the metal floor. Other gunners opened fire at the same moment. From above, below, and beside the aircraft, streams of tracer rounds crossed the sky. The German fighter continued its climb. At 300 yards, the Bf-109 fired its own weapons. Twin 20mm MG-151 cannons released explosive shells toward the bomber formation. One round struck the right wing of a B-17 flying in the adjacent combat box. A small section of aluminum skin tore away near the outer fuel tank. Captain Morgan saw the aircraft fall slightly behind the formation. Losing formation position was dangerous. Bombers that fell behind quickly became isolated targets. The first German fighter streaked past the formation. Within seconds, more followed. FW-190 fighters approached from the right flank at high speed. Each carried two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns mounted in the wings. Their pilots fired quick bursts before rolling away. Inside the dorsal turret, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper rotated the turret to track a diving fighter. Harper fired a controlled burst. The turret mounted two Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing more than 700 rounds per minute. The Focke-Wulf rolled sharply to avoid the stream of tracers. The first attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Then the sky became quiet again, but the silence was temporary. The first wave had been designed to test the formation defenses. German controllers were already directing a second group of interceptors toward the bomber stream. At 10:45 in the morning, the second wave appeared. This time the fighters approached from the front. Head-on attacks were among the most dangerous tactics used against heavy bombers. The closing speed between a bomber flying 150 miles per hour and a fighter approaching at 300 miles per hour created a combined closing speed near 450 miles per hour. That meant a pilot had only seconds to aim. The first aircraft in the new wave were FW-190 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 3. They approached directly toward the lead combat box. Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Wilson watched through the glass nose compartment. The fighter aircraft appeared suddenly in the center of his view. Wilson immediately swung the nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns toward the approaching target. Distance closed rapidly. 1,000 yards, 800, 600. Both aircraft opened fire. Cannon shells passed through the bomber formation. One B-17 in the lead group suffered a direct hit to the cockpit area. The aircraft rolled out of formation and began descending. Inside Captain Morgan aircraft, the sound of impacts echoed through the fuselage as fragments struck the aluminum skin. The B-17 armor plating protected the cockpit, but the aircraft structure itself remained vulnerable. A cannon shell struck the left horizontal stabilizer. The explosion tore a section of control surface fabric away. Lieutenant Taylor glanced at the control indicators. The aircraft still responded normally, but the damage confirmed a difficult truth. The bomber had just survived 2 waves of fighter attacks, and the formation had not even reached the target yet. German fighter controllers were already directing additional interceptors toward the bomber stream. Units from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 1 were now climbing toward the bombers from airfields deeper inside Germany. Captain Morgan checked the fuel gauges and the engine temperatures. The mission required another 150 miles before reaching Schweinfurt. The crew had already fired hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and the most dangerous part of the journey was still ahead, because the next group of German fighters would not attack in small groups. They would arrive in numbers large enough to break the formation itself. At 10:58 in the morning, the bomber formation was approaching the industrial corridor of southern Germany. The Lied elements of the American force were now less than 100 miles west of Schweinfurt. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, Captain Robert Morgan studied the engine gauges again. Cylinder head temperatures on the 4, right R1820. Cyclone engines remained within acceptable limits. Oil pressure was steady. The aircraft had already endured 2 separate interception attempts, but the mission plan had always assumed something worse. German fighter units located deeper inside the country had the advantage of shorter flight distances. Their aircraft could reach the bomber stream with nearly full fuel and ammunition. At 11:03 in the morning, the warning came from the top turret. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper rotated the turret toward the left horizon. Large group approaching, 10 o'clock high. Captain Morgan lifted his head toward the windshield. At first, the shapes appeared small and scattered. Then the pattern became clear. More than 30 fighters were descending from above the bomber formation. The aircraft belonged primarily to Jagdgeschwader 26, a unit with extensive experience intercepting heavy bombers over Western Europe. Many of the fighters were Focke-Wulf FW-190, a design that carried heavy armament in the wings. Each aircraft typically mounted 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Their pilots had learned that the best method against a tight bomber formation was coordinated attacks from multiple directions. At 11:04 in the morning, the fighters divided into groups. One group moved toward the right flank of the American formation. Another group climbed above the bombers to begin steep diving attacks. A third group approached from the rear. Inside the bomber, the interphone system came alive with overlapping reports. Fighters high. Right side closing fast. Multiple contacts, 6 o'clock. Captain Morgan held the aircraft steady. The most important rule inside a bomber formation was simple. Never break position unless the aircraft was completely disabled. If one bomber turned away, the entire defensive grid of machine guns would weaken. At 11:05 in the morning, the third attack began. The first FW-190 dove from above at an angle close to 40 degrees. The fighter pilot fired a burst from the wing cannons at roughly 600 yards. Explosive shells crossed the bomber formation. One round struck the outer engine of a B-17 in the combat box ahead of Captain Morgan aircraft. The engine burst into flame. Within seconds, the damaged bomber began losing altitude. Its crew attempted to stay in formation, but the fire spread along the wing route. Inside Captain Morgan aircraft, the gunners opened fire again. Sergeant Michael Torres leaned against the waist window mount and tracked an incoming fighter. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun thundered in short bursts. Tracer rounds crossed the path of a diving FW-190. The fighter pulled away sharply, but the attack continued. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbed upward from below the bomber stream and fired directly toward the nose section of Morgan aircraft. Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Wilson reacted immediately. He fired both nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns. The combined fire from Wilson and the dorsal turret forced the German pilot to roll away. Still, the attack achieved its purpose. German fighters were not always trying to destroy every bomber immediately. Many attacks aimed to disrupt the formation. Even a small gap could allow later fighters to isolate a single aircraft. At 11:07 in the morning, cannon fragments struck the fuselage of Morgan bomber near the radio compartment. Radio operator Sergeant Harold Lewis checked the equipment quickly. The SCR-274N radio transmitter remained functional. Communication with the formation was still intact. But the bomber had already consumed nearly half of the ammunition supply carried by several gunners. The crew had been defending the aircraft for nearly 40 minutes. The psychological pressure inside the bomber was constant. Each crew member understood the distance remaining before the target. Another 70 miles. If the formation could survive long enough to release its bombs over the ball-bearing factories, the mission could still succeed. But the enemy defenses ahead were not limited to fighter aircraft. The next threat waiting over Schweinfurt was already being prepared by the German air defense network. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the city were loading 88mm Flak guns. Those weapons could reach bombers flying above 20,000 feet. And unlike fighter attacks, flak bursts did not require a pilot to aim. They only required precise calculations from ground-based fire control crews. At 11:14 in the morning, Captain Morgan could see smoke columns rising from the industrial district ahead. The formation was approaching the target area. The third fighter attack had finally broken away. But the most dangerous defensive system of the entire mission was now directly ahead. Because the bomber crews had survived the fighters, now they had to fly straight and level through the heaviest anti-aircraft fire protecting one of the most important industrial targets in Germany. And for the next several minutes, turning away would not be an option.